Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Inspiring Leadership Podcast. And I'm delighted to have my co-host, Graham Brown. Graham and I love the banter that we have between us and the passion that we have for inspiring leadership and the many topics. We're now on brand quotient, BQ, brand reputation, image, and impact. So, Graham, for you, what does it mean for you? This idea that said by Jeff Bezos, actually, what people say about you when you're not in the room. You've written a book on it, haven't you?
I have, yeah. I wrote a book. Thanks for asking, Jonathan. Never thought you were going to ask. But now that you twist my arm about the book that I wrote, I did write a book called Brand Love: How to Build a Brand Worth Talking About, which actually has that quote from Jeff Bezos in it. So really, the nub of the book was that effectively brand isn't a logo. It's not a mascot. It's really what people say about you. So it's the experience that people have about you and your organization. I think what we're seeing now, Jonathan, is, and obviously being podcasters, we're at the sort of cutting edge of this, is that a lot of the experience that people have about traditional brands isn't through ad agencies or even advertising, but through the people. So I think hopefully today we talk a lot about that brand experience through people, whether it's the leaders, or the conversations about those leaders. That's what makes the brand.
And I think it is so interesting that you've written about brand love and that real connection you have with somebody. And as I often said to people, leaders that I coach, they're learning you, not what you're doing. So not what you're saying. They're learning how you're behaving and the way you come across. And brand is like trust. It takes years to build a brand, and it can be destroyed overnight. And I think people sort of forget that they sort of make some decisions which lack the MQ, the moral quotient, and that destroys overnight their brand, what people think about them, and whether they're prepared to trust themselves. So one of my interesting experiences when I was in an organization called Penna, where there was about 6 managing directors, different businesses. And I was board and executive coaching. There was consulting, there was outplacement, there was exec search, there was interim. And what happened was we were expected to cross-sell, but I actually had to be really comfortable to introduce somebody else to my client. I wanted them to be good enough in their specialism and good interpersonal skills, because on a couple of occasions, if I introduced someone from, executive search, and they were just busy on the sell and the transaction, but they didn't care about the relationship, the client would come to me and go, look, I don't know who that idiot was, but please don't bring them back. And Jonathan, really? Do you think I would like them? What were you thinking? I was like, so I then, after that bitter experience in my early years, I was always careful to make sure that if I was going to share somebody I trusted, and I was their advisor, their trusted advisor, I had to bring someone good in, which is why the idea of you and I doing a joint podcast with some awesome guests is going to be so much fun, a bit like Rory and Alistair. I think we're definitely going to
bring it on.
We're definitely going to do it. So Graham, let's have a look at a couple of the questions from last month from the audiences on brand. So a CEO and a founder of a business in New York asked, Jonathan, brand, what are the benefits of having unattributable 360 feedback by all levels of the organization on the CEO and on the leadership team members? Graham, any thoughts about that?
360, a very sort of popular mechanism internally to identify blind spots, to identify, the truth, if you like. I feel, a lot of this focus on culture really sometimes misses out what we call traditionally management by walking around. That those insights that you get from walking the factory floor. Now in Japanese, they have a special term for this. It's called genchi genbutsu. And Toyota took this to their heart in their management philosophy. Genchi genbutsu just means go and see. And so, these 360 feedbacks are kind of like that, but, asking people directly for feedback. I think the missing part of that is for leaders to go out and walk around, because if you get feedback from people, it's one thing, but to actually go and see is something else. And there's a great story I don't know if I mentioned it in a previous podcast, but it's in my book actually, John. It's about Lego, and Lego became one of the most valuable private businesses in the world. You know, is one of the most recognizable brands. You know, grandparents don't buy knockoff Lego for their grandkids. They buy the real thing, right? Lego. They can trust it. That's the trust aspect, right? It's interesting, like when this incoming CEO of Lego went to his organization to get that 360, the first thing he did was just spend days looking around and walking around the shop floor, if you like, and see what people did with Lego. And one thing he realized was that the engineers of Lego spent too much time in the organization and not enough time outside it. And that's the first thing he did. He said, look, I don't want you to see you at your desks. I want you to see you out there. And like, I guess you can get 360, but that would be missing from that insight is that, you know, why are all these people here when they should be out there talking to customers?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think there's two parts to it. I'm not sure if I'm making myself clear, but there's two parts to a 360. One is to get the feedback from your people, but also for you as a leader to go out there and see things for yourself.
I love that. I really love that. It's almost like Back to the Floor. There was a program where senior CEOs and generals were sent back down to see and experience what it was like for the people doing those jobs in the front line. And I think of a brigadier friend of mine who, when he left the military, he went to a job at Stowe School. And he was given an organization chart where him and the bursar and a pyramid. And he went, hang on, let me just turn this upside down. And he put it against his shoulders and he goes, yeah, I think that would fit. I think I can support these people. So he saw it as the other way around. How can you get out there and see who are the people who were actually interacting with the school, with parents, with the groundsmen and the like. But 360, I'm very keen on it. And so is Lee. We designed the Inspiring Leadership 360 as a psychometric people can take online. But we use it with all our CEOs because the danger is that they get into this period of deluding themselves. They go, well, I'm fantastic. I'm great. I must be good because I'm being paid so much and I'm really successful. Our business is doing well. But actually, they can easily take their own Kool-Aid. And so actually going out and having the perceptions of other people, what do people think about you? It's their perception. It's not the reality, but for them, perception is reality. And I was worried by a leader the other day, and she said to me, I'm not interested in doing 360. I don't care what they think. Whoa. Now that's dangerous.
Red flag, right?
Do not care what they think. Then that's the arrogance, and then that's the danger of I'm some godlike being who makes all the decisions. And you know what? If you don't like it, you can lump it, and that's not healthy. Okay.
I was just on that. I know you'd probably enjoy this, and being a military man, at the weekend I was watching a documentary about the Falklands.
Oh yeah.
And the military, they took some of the teams back to the Falklands and relive it.
Wow.
And it was but the interesting thing was about everybody was talking about intel. And, you know, it's kind of like that's your 360, isn't it? It doesn't matter if you're like, you know, you're running a unit on the ground, your team, whatever. It doesn't matter. What matters is intel, and that's really what 360 is, isn't it? Like all good military and business operations run on great intel. And that, you know, somebody who says I don't care, you wouldn't go into battle without good intel. Can you imagine going fighting the enemy without intel? You just like, you know, you're walking into just a kamikaze mission, right? It's just crazy. That's really bad leadership.
Exactly that. And I served with the Scots Guards just a year after they came back from the Falklands War. So I was there with them in 84 to 86, and they were recovering from Mount Tumbledown. My own platoon, 13th platoon of left flank of the 2nd Battalion Scots Guards, had gone up Mount Tumbledown against the 5th Marine Battalion, who were very well trained, mountain and Arctic warfare trained. And so they were on this peak and they were ferocious to take on. And the information they had, as you say, the information was wrong. So they actually went into a minefield as they were advancing towards the enemy position in the dark, in a blizzard, going into a minefield. Can you imagine what that's like? And then for the platoon commander, who was my predecessor, he saw his sergeant beside him machine gunned and killed.
Yeah.
And he was only 19 years old. And so he was going up this peak, and he was quite scared. So he relied on the two lance sergeants, who one had been a meth drinker in Glasgow, and the other one was a pretty violent man from Glasgow as well. But they were in their element on that mountainside. They just lined up the machine guns and the rocket launchers, and they kept taking out these rugged peaks as they were going up there. And then the other interesting person was General John Kisley, as he is now. He was Major John Kisley, who was the company commander. And he had Guardsman Galloway, who did the Cyprus Double Mountain Marathon with me. He was one of my team. And Galloway had been promoted and bust so many times because he was a bit of a bruiser, but kept doing things that you shouldn't do.
Bit of a maverick, I think.
On that mountainside, John Kisley shouted, "Are you with me? Left flank." That was his company, left flank. In the dark, wanting to go and attack this machine gun nest at the top. And this voice came, "Aye, I'm with you, sir." And it was Galloway. And he could only hear one voice. And he goes, "Are you with me, left flank?" He goes, "I said, fucking with you, sir. Let's go." And the two of them attacked this thing, but they'd run out of bullets.
Yeah.
They fired for a long time, and the Argentinians' heads were down. And so he then threw some socks, I think. He just took and shouted "grenade," and their heads went down, and then they went in and they had a vicious knife fight, literally a knife fight in the trench, which is where they both got their medals. John Kisley got the Military Cross. But it's this point about intel. They didn't know who they're against. But also it's another thing about inspiration. John Kisley, a hugely inspiring person. But also Galloway, in his own quiet way, massively inspiring, prepared to do great things. So, yeah, interesting one. You got me off on Falklands War story.
I love it. It was great.
And the only other one I'll share with you was I was with the Green Howards for much of my 10 years, of my 20 years. And we had an officer who served in the SAS, and he and his troop were working against the Argentinians behind the lines, and the Argentinian special forces found them, and there was this battle going on, and he stayed and he fought to the end so the guys could get away, and he died. And the Argentinians said that the special forces said, "We'd never met such a brave man as this guy." And they buried him with full honors because they just said this man was ferocious, and he allowed the rest of them to live.
I think the key point there, like for the listeners as well, is that, bravery without intel is recklessness. Like the people that are brave and make an impact and do heroic deeds or work or, great work, don't just simply throw themselves in. They probably doesn't come across by their character, but they do read these situations very well. I think that's really important, isn't it? That, again, it's like you can't just be like gung-ho and just be brave and like get at something and hope you get results. You've got to have that intel, that 360, because otherwise, the blind spots are what undoes people, right? The blind spots in leadership, the blind spots in military. So many stories of like recklessness that could have been bravery if it was done properly, right? And that's the challenge, I think, with leadership, is that you have that sort of, the confidence bias that you believe you can do this simply. We see it with like leaders, like startup founders, think, "Oh, you just got to follow your passion." And then so they follow their passion, they start a business, and then they lose everything, right? Just because they were following their passion. It's not how it works. You've got to follow your passion and have good intel, right? So I think this is kind of like where we need that balance, and I would warn anybody that thinks that they don't need it. That's a red flag.
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting. One of the other guests, General David Petraeus, we were talking about on his podcast the other week, he said one of his favorite books is Grant Takes Command, about General Ulysses S. Grant. And being someone who listens to audiobooks a lot, I've spent sort of 25 hours listening to Grant Takes Command. It's not a light book. But he was very much a bit like you were describing. He took on Robert E. Lee, who was, I think, probably one of, the two of them were some of the best generals the Americans have had of that period. But Grant was very attritionalist. He would just carry on putting more and more regiments in. and hundreds died. And he'd just keep grinding the attrition machine. And I think you've got to be careful that sort of there's a balance between, you know, clever thinking and just recklessly pouring more people into it, or more money when you should actually stop. John Hamilton was the name of the officer in the Green Hounds who was in the Special Forces and died saving his guys. Captain John Hamilton. One of the questions from a CMO in the UK, brand quotient. This is more about social media and everybody, not so much what we're talking about, but how do you improve your personal brand reputation, image, and impact on social media and in reality? What's your advice?
That's a great one. So now we're talking about in the context of an individual personal brand, and that's kind of new. I think this is a real challenge, Jonathan, for leaders of a certain generation, certain age, because we're kind of caught now that if you're, let's say you're on the wrong side of 35, you didn't kind of grow up with the TikTok generation, yet you are now beholden to the economics of the attention economy, if you like, you know, which is, if you don't have people's attention, you don't lead, you don't influence. So personal brand is like, it's very easy for a teenager now to think about personal brand and go out there and do it and do the dance on TikTok and that kind of thing. But what do you do if you're like, you know, 40, 50 and you've got 20 years of experience? You're not going to go on TikTok and do that, are you? So now we're in this sort of interesting transition phase where the leaders have the biggest challenge because they have the most to lose. You know, a teenager doing it, nothing to lose, but a leader, they go on social media, they say something, they get cancelled. This is the challenge. So to answer the question, you know, what do you do? I think you have to understand, like, what are you about? What's your talking points? Let's start there, start the process, get on stage, literally, you know, get on a podcast, guest on podcast, start your podcasts, start that process. No, you know, if we think about it in the context, I always, like, when I work a lot with guests, getting them on podcasts, I work a lot with leaders, getting them booked on podcasts. And, you know, this is a personal brand journey for them. I say to them, look, think of this like stand-up comedy. Now, no comedian was born funny. That's the reality, right? You know, if you see a funny stand-up comic, that guy, I guarantee, has been on stage thousands of times and he's practiced, you know, Jerry Seinfeld, all of that stuff, right? And so if you want to talk about building a personal brand, you're not going to be funny day one. But you've got to get on stage. You've got to get on stage and face the moment of truth. Social media, you know, posting stuff on LinkedIn, Twitter, and stuff like that, that's okay. But that's not how you're going to refine your story. You're going to refine your story by doing this, by committing to the moment of truth, getting on stage, committing to an audience, and facing rejection. So, you know, you can spend 20,000 hours tweeting on social media and get nothing. Or you can get on stage in front of an audience, even if the audience is 20 people or one host, and start that journey. That's how you become really good. That's how you refine your story, because every time you commit your story to the universe and get feedback, and that feedback could be from a host like you, Jonathan, and, you know, you laugh at something, you don't get something, or you add to something, that then becomes this evolving story, which becomes your brand that you take away and turn into effectively what people identify and experience you as.
And it's very interesting that, you know, people are very lucky to get you as their advisor to help them get onto podcasts, you host their podcast for them. You make it happen for leaders who just haven't got the time or the skills and the technology to make it happen. And I know many people I know have valued what you've done. And it's interesting you talk about committing and refining your story. Some people take that too far. The refining and the polishing the diamond, they actually begin to make up a story that isn't even true. Like, you know, you can see this with one or two US politicians. When you look into their CV, it isn't true what they say
Mm.
they've done.
Mm.
Or you have someone like Liz Truss, who actually denies that any of the problems she created for our children who can't now get mortgages or can't move house were nothing to do with her. It's all about everybody else and the left-wing conspiracy or the economy, stupid.
You missed somebody, Jonathan. We've got a whole podcast without mentioning that guy.
No, I can't mention him. I won't mention him.
It will come up. If you're outside the UK, a former prime minister that Jonathan likes to bring up, who he has beef. You mentioned one of them. You mentioned Liz Truss, who was his
trained by him. Yeah, that's right. She learned everything from him. But
sorry, I disrupted your train of thought.
No, it just brings this point about people have got to be very careful. And I don't know whether you've ever done it, but I know if looking back, I may have just sort of tried to make myself look better than I really am.
Of course.
And every time I've done that, the more someone once said to me this very good point, which I think is so true. The more you try and sell yourself, the less people are likely to buy you.
Yeah.
And I know when I try to oversell myself to someone, I could see them back away. And I went, not again. I'm not going to do that. So actually, it's the story of the two Dutch admirals. Like, do you know the story, the Dutch admirals?
Tell me.
So back in the Dutch Navy, when Holland and Britain were at war, and ultimately, I suppose the Dutch, who were the reserve currency, became the more powerful, the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company. But these two Dutch admirals began as midshipmen and lowly midshipmen, and they worked their way up till they became the top two admirals in the Dutch Navy. And what they did, let's call them Graham and Jonathan. When people would say to Jonathan, you really are, very good as a podcaster. Well, actually, that's really kind to say that. But actually, I learned everything I know from Graham Brown. He's a superb podcaster, taught me so much, and I really respect and admire him. And that gave credibility clearly to the other admiral. And then when someone would say to Graham, well done, run a great podcast agency, and I love the way you come across naturally. So, well, it's kind of you, but actually the person I look to is Jonathan. He just certainly has a way with people. And so it went on that they never bragged about themselves. They looked after others, genuine, not inauthentic. They genuinely gave the credit to others. And I think leaders forget this in their brand or their search for, I'm the CEO. I made all the decisions. No, if you think it's all about you. I mean, it was Arnold Schwarzenegger. I stood on the shoulders of giants. Those people, men and women, made him bigger. And I think that's a lovely, inspiring leadership, authentic way of doing it. What do you think?
Oh yeah, can't argue with that. That's I mean, you definitely see that with a lot of media celebrities in the podcast space who, I mean, you've mentioned the types that do kind of take all the glory, but a lot will focus on almost promoting their network. And Joe Rogan's a good example of that. It's all about the host, the guest, and, really just bigging them up. And that's kind of really made him successful because just by association, he's become successful as well, and he's always, even if you look at his social media, it's always promoting his guest, more than just, this episode. It's about, I had the wonderful and powerful Jonathan Bowman-Perks on my show, and, it was all about him. And, so absolutely. I mean, that's a good sign of a good leader, isn't it? Somebody who can kind of, facilitate that and be a platform for it as opposed to take all the glory for it.
And that's whether it be in your book, Brand Love, or whether it be in your agency, that's your job, is to lift the other people you have in their own organizations. They might want to get their message across, and how they're going to do it using podcasts. I think it's very successful. You and I were chatting before the show started about people confusing charisma with character in this age of populism, and that book, Revenge of Power, by Moises Naam, in which he talks about 3 P's leaders, often in politics. They're populism, post-truth, and polarization. And this idea that that we go for someone who's got great charisma and wow, larger than life, and perhaps a reality TV show host, or The Apprentice or whatever with Trump, or he's a wrestler or whatever. They go, oh, great. And they make him the leader, but does the leader have character? I mean, you look at Ukraine with Zelensky. I mean, he was a comedian, but actually he has turned out to have real a core of character with him. But
Mm.
sometimes you can get it badly wrong, or in certain countries, the big, larger-than-life Bolsonaro or whoever it might be, you've got to be careful that people don't just go for charisma and something different from boring day-to-day politics.
Yeah.
That they want charismatic, not someone who has character, integrity, and honesty. What do you think, Graham?
Yeah, we live in an interesting time, and obviously we are in a media landscape that favors people who have strong opinions. And you mentioned Bolsonaro. You've got people like Trump, obviously. We're not too far away from conversations about people like Andrew Tate, as an example. And a lot of that is to do with not just the algorithms favoring that kind of voice, because it's a polarized message, and therefore it attracts a lot of followers around that flag. They're rallying around that cause, and therefore that favors how algorithms look at those kind of messages. But it speaks to a world in which we live in, where like if you speak to the middleman or the middle ground or the mass market, you're nothing. So the key here, really, Jonathan, is what do we take away from that? It's the same with brand love. It's like the key message was that you have to be loved rather than liked. 100 people that love your brand is worth more than 1 million that simply like it, because if people like you, you might as well be invisible. Now, the corollary of that is that whilst that promotes these strong opinions and these very polarizing messages, the other part to it is the integrity that you mentioned, which is actually strong opinions is going to be everywhere. We only need to go back 90 years to see, the rise of strong opinions across Europe, the rise of fascism in Mussolini, Hitler, and so on. So this is nothing new. The difference now is that everybody kind of has a level playing field. So those strong opinions could just be an influencer. But for us, the challenge as leaders is not to play that game, but to understand it and use it to our benefit and have strong opinions. But as Jeff Bezos, bringing him up again, has been kind of misattributed with the quote, it's strong opinions loosely held. That's really important. We have to have strong opinions, but they have to be loosely held, meaning that we're not convicted to the opinions. These aren't the 4 legs of the table we've built our world on. Like if we take away something, that's the end of it. We have to adapt. And the difference between someone who's got strong opinions loosely held as a leader and somebody who's just got strong opinions is that the guy who loosely holds that opinions, even though they are strongly behind them, is willing to listen and do the 360, is willing to change if needed. And we've seen that. Robert Kennedy, we've mentioned before on this podcast, is a great example of that. Strong opinions loosely held, very much pivoted his worldviews and beliefs from where he started to where he ended up. And I think that's a sign of a good leader. They're willing to change. And Muhammad Ali said this, if you think the same and you say the same things as you did 20 years ago, you've just wasted 20 years of your life. The problem is today for leaders is that you said something 20 years ago and now you're saying this. It's like, oh, you're a hypocrite. We have to be able to evolve. That's the part of life and living. We evolve and we change our minds. So why not encourage that and celebrate that amongst leaders?
Yeah, so well put. And I love the historical connotations. It made me remember Churchill's quote when he was criticized in the House for changing his opinion on something. He said, "The honourable gentleman may criticize me for changing my opinion, but when the facts change, I change my opinion. What do you do?" And I thought that was so lovely, that you need to look at the situation and make a judgment on it rather than being blind to it. And this is where we then go on to the other conversation you and I were having about the age of narcissism that we're in now, with Instagram, reality TV shows, with all these people with sort of lots of pumping up in their faces and their bodies to make themselves look Instagram ready, or whatever pictures they're sending out there are airbrushed to make it look different. And it's quite refreshing when you get some of the models who actually then post pictures of themselves without airbrushing, with all the pimples and the zits and all the wobbly bits that are still on there. But what are you getting to see? Is this, and this goes back to our health question, which we knew before, that it creates for our children's generation, your son and my 4 children, this obsession with how they look, starting from a very young age, and this ideal of how they should be something that's unachievable, because even the superstars don't really look like that in reality, but they've been airbrushed out of existence. So what's your thoughts?
Yeah, it's tough, isn't it? If you are growing up in this world, it seems to be a lot harder to, accept yourself as you are. But I wonder if that's always been the case. I know, like, we grew up in a world of advertising, and we were subjected to a sort of a carousel of improbable bodies and improbable lives that made us, it thrives off inadequacy, right? Advertising thrives off that, and social media is just another form of it. I don't think it's new. The whole, whether, years ago, Jonathan, you and I would have watched TV, and I don't know if you remember those old Nescafe Gold adverts where they had these sort of like very like cultured and good-looking couples, like the lives they lived, which was so much better than our boring lives because they drank Nescafe coffee. And it's no different from like looking at influencers on social media and in Instagram today and making us feel the same, whether they got the 6-pack or they're flying on a private jet. It's the same. It's advertising. It's just like, like the Better Homes magazine. I think it was on The Simpsons that did a parody, and it used to say better homes than yours. It's kind of like those sense of inadequacy that advertising makes us feel, that we have to be mindful of it. And the only way to sort of almost kind of deal with it is not to kind of shut it out, because that's impossible, but to create a space inside yourself, that sort of inner truth, if that makes sense, that sort of groundedness. And we can certainly do that for our children. And that's what leaders need to do, right? Like help people understand that actually they have a sense and a value in themselves, which isn't necessarily determined by things outside of them, what other people think. And I think it's supporting people for the, that sense of self-worth, as opposed to, judging people by comparison, right? Which is ultimately what it is. I mean, it's the old maxim, isn't it? Comparison is the thief of joy. You and I are both very ambitious and competitive people, and I'm sure we are very well aware how that can take joy out of small things, because it's I did that, but it wasn't as good as this guy. I did an Ironman, but he did this. And so we got to be aware of it. I guess that's the point, isn't it, Jonathan? We just got to have this kind of meta awareness that this thing exists and step out of it.
Yeah, I so agree with you. And of course, we've laughed that one of the things when doing the Hoffman process I was working on was being competitive and comparative. And this drive for high performance all the time can be incredibly tiresome, particularly for people living with you or with you. And this idea that the whole marketing industry, in many ways, whether it be pushing Kellogg's cornflakes, where there's more nutrition in the cardboard box than actually in the cereal itself, which has got lots of added sugar, and how that whole food brands are selling you an idea of health and well-being, which is actually the opposite. It's actually creating obese people with a standard American diet, and so sugar drinks and lots of processed foods are not good for you as much as they'll try and tell you it is. And I think this idea that I've got to watch, okay, how many watches do I need? How often, how many watches can I wear? Oh, well, you could change one over every week. So you need a row of them, have 7, and then you can have them with a rocker and change them. And so creating this idea of a need, and that you are not good enough, and you'll be happy when, I'll be happy when ... So I think when we think about our brand, we do, as you say, have to manage that whole industry, which is trying to make us feel inadequate and missing something. There's a piece, I'll be happy when, and that success is getting what you want, but always remember happiness is wanting what you already have. And I think a lot of people already have enough.
Yeah.
And one of the great questions, before I pass it back over to you, to think about what sells and things like that, AI bots, and we'll talk about ChatGPT, you just spoke about that, is there was a lovely question from Nancy Klein, one of the ladies she worked with, who asked two questions. How much is enough?
Yeah.
And how will you know when you have enough? And I think those are very powerful questions, because I meet these people who are making lots of money, and they go, but so and so earns more than me, so I'll be happy when I earn more than them. So it becomes an arms race.
I met a chap once many years ago in my travels. He's semi-famous, a British guy. He sold his business for 400 million, where he floated it on the stock exchange. And I remember chatting with him, and he had a very nice life materially. And he said to me, I've only got 10 million pounds in my bank accounts, and it scares the hell out of me. And he had a few wines at the time, so he was kind of a bit liberal with his conversations. But it really changed. At the time, I was driving for his lifestyle. I wanted to become like him. But when he told me that, I think it was a pivotal moment, an epiphany moment, when actually, it's endless. It will never be satisfied. And if he's scared and he's gone through all of that, then what is there at the end of it? And to the point about, going back to the personal brand thing, is that the challenge that a lot of people have is they compare themselves to other branding gurus. So they compare themselves to Andrew Tate or Gary Vee or Tony Robbins or, take your pick. And they think, well, I'm not like him. Why would anybody want to hear my story, Jonathan? But that's the problem, is that then they feel inadequate. But actually, it's that celebrating what you have. Actually, I guarantee every one of your listeners, if you got on a podcast, you have an interesting story. It's just that you probably have felt a little bit of imposter syndrome. That, I'm not Steve Jobs. Why would anyone want to hear about my story? But I guarantee in your story, there's something interesting. I guarantee that every single one of you listening here today has, left a job and taken on some risk, or left the country and moved somewhere new, or did something that was against what was the received wisdom of the time, against the advice of friends and family. I bet everybody's done that, because that's living. And everybody who did that, who's a listener, has a story to tell. Because I guarantee if you've done that, then you are a leader, because there is somebody right there now who might be staring out of an office window thinking, I want to do that. But you've done it. And the fact that you've done it is inspiration enough for that person, for them to do it as well. And that's why you should tell that story, not because, you're a billionaire or you're on the front page of Forbes. And I think that's the important thing about the imposter syndrome, is that it will stop so many people telling their stories, because they're comparing themselves to what else is out there.
I think it's one of your great skills as a storyteller, is you can listen to somebody and then help them put it in a format that people can understand, they can follow, and they can learn some lessons from it. Because, this goes back to primeval time. How do we pass on ways of doing things? Good advice, always in a story. And I love your ability to get people to tell stories. Talk about stories. We're going to be surpassed by ChatGPT and AI as it learns how to tell stories. What do you reckon that will have an impact on people's brand and how they can use it? I mean, I saw someone was advertising coaching using ChatGPT, learn how to make the most of it and coach using it. And I've registered with it. I'm using the AI, but I've been asking questions about my forthcoming holiday and locations, and about the American Civil War.
It's the end of search, Jonathan. At the end of search, this is going to kill Google's business.
I think so. I think I won't use Google anymore. I'll use this, because it gives me the best I can get. Yeah, what's going to happen, do you reckon, to Google? That'd be interesting.
Well, yeah, it's certainly going to radically change their business, because if you're doing this already, that's the end. It's you're not talking about high, super early adopters or very technical people. It's people are now saying, well, what if I ask ChatGPT this instead? So basically, this is very interesting. What we're experiencing now is what the author Michio Kaku, who's written some great books, and he's a really interesting chap on YouTube, a cosmologist, I suppose. He said that AI is the new electricity. So if you think about what electricity did if you look at economically, electricity created, they believe, 20 to 30 years of consistent GDP growth since its introduction, because it enabled all these derivative industries. It wasn't just electricity. The fact, for example, that you could have a light bulb in the house meant not only that you could work outside of typical sort of dusk to dawn, dawn to dusk, sorry, but you could also work in a factory. And so, it created this completely different rhythm to life. Interestingly, also, thanks to electricity, we had sliced bread, because what happened is that now workers didn't have the time to cut bread and, eat it like in the normal fashion. They had to kind of, the wives had to kind of cut it up nicely for the husbands, and then they would go to the office or the factory. So all these kind of knock-on things happening, and Chat GPT is the beginning. It's like the first sort of light bulb happening in the world of AI that's actually practical for us now. Now, to bring it into the context of storytelling, you've got to look at ChatGPT really as a tool that can do a lot of pattern recognition. And there's not just ChatGPT, there's lots of image, what they call generative AI programs like DALL-E or Stable Diffusion, which you can say, I've tested it, for example, like, a picture of a woman talking on a microphone, which we use for podcasting, right? And it will generate that based on millions and millions of patterns it sees out there, and create this sort of composite. So wow. Writing is no different, right? If you look, for example, so at the moment I'm kind of into playing chess with my son. He's going through a chess phase, right? I haven't played chess for years, Jonathan, but I used to play at school. So now he's kind of playing on chess.com, and we're sort of challenging each other. And it's nice to spend time together on a real wooden chessboard, right? A non-digital thing. But chess, like the grandmasters of chess, don't have strategies. They just recognize lots and lots of patterns. Now, here's the interesting thing. A lot of human talent is nothing more than the ability to recognize lots and lots of patterns. For example, a doctor spends 60% of his or her time outside of paperwork looking at diagnosis scans, right? That's what they do. And AI can do that a lot better. A lawyer spends a lot of time reading case law and, what's the precedent for this, right? And then it's the same with an accountant, tax codes. If you think about it, all of these jobs are fundamentally spreadsheet pattern driven. Now you take that into the world of creativity, it's not a lot different. A lot of it is patterns, and those patterns can be learned. So the interesting thing is that what ChatGPT signals is this beginning of an era where a lot of what we think is creative is actually going to be replaced by AI. What does that do for us? Well, it doesn't necessarily replace us. What it does do is it pushes us further up the chain of value, like beyond, for example, writing an article, forget it. Like ChatGPT does it so much better. Writing an email, ChatGPT does it better. Humans won't need to do this anymore. So the question is, what is left? And it goes back to that apocryphal tale. Now that we've mentioned Churchill, let's bring him back in. Apparently, and it's very apocryphal, he was asked during the war to cut funds to education and the arts because they needed to fund the war effort, and they were running out of cash. The Great British Empire was nearly bankrupt. And they said, well, cut the arts. And he supposedly retorted, then what are we fighting for? And this really helps us understand the value of AI and what it means to us. Is actually the reason we're automating all of this stuff is not simply to automate our lives, but to elevate our existence, to focus on that very human connection, that very human experience, which machines cannot replace. If you look at art, if you listen to music, you don't listen to a music because AI has generated it, right? Those paintings that they get like elephants or a parrot to do, somewhere in Thailand on holiday, it's an elephant and it looks like a Jackson Pollock, right? But it isn't a Jackson Pollock because it doesn't have his story, and like you listen to music and you like the music, but you connect with the artist, the musician, right? Because that musician has suffered and was vulnerable and had experienced the kind of things that you experienced, right? When, you listen to every single song, like I don't know, Ticket to Ride, the Beatles, right? You know, it's one of the most famous songs ever, but it's about losing, it's about loss, it's about bittersweet memories, right? AI has never experienced that. AI has never made a mistake. So the whole point, long rant about Chat GPT, Jonathan, but we've got to understand where this takes us. It's the same as what Churchill says. What are we automating for? We have to understand that this is very top level human experience that we have to double down on. If you're a doctor, you know, your future doesn't lie in recognizing better and better scans, because I tell you, you're losing that game. Your future lies in going and sitting next to a patient and saying, are you okay? Because that is what AI cannot do. And that is the future in everything that we need to train, not just leaders today, but the next generation of leaders. You've got to double down on that human experience. And that human experience is vulnerability. Everything that a machine cannot do.
I think it's fascinating, and I'd love you to send me anything you've got on tutorials or just making the most of ChatGPT, because I am interested really in learning it and mastering how to get the most from it. But I, as someone who obviously my job is to connect with people, and I think back to when I was told by my teacher I was thick because I couldn't do my maths and I couldn't spell. You know, ChatGPT can do the spelling for me now, and but my mother did say to me, Jonathan, you'll be good with people. Your skill will be in connecting with people and understanding them. And I think of my father's co-pilot, who, when we had that very moving moment when he and my father's other pilot both told me that they lived because my father died to save their lives. And I go, bloody hell. But they said, but Jonathan, you got to decide, am I a victim, poor me, or are you going to use your father's inspiration to connect with people, find their stories and their lessons and pass them on to others to inspire them? So I'm hoping that in a world of Chat GPT and AI, there'll still be a need for people like me and you to connect with people, draw stories, make a personal, emotional, intelligent, vulnerable, authentic link with somebody. What do you think?
You're preaching to the choir, Jonathan. I think, like, especially what you're doing, like in element coaching in its sort of modern format, is, you know, what good coaches do is ask questions. So Chat GPT is that, you know, like, you only get out what you ask. So actually there is now, you know, I think within a couple of years, there will be jobs for people who will be a Chat GPT question operator. It sounds ridiculous. But the interesting thing is, like, if you're a coach, you know what questions to ask. That's what you're good at. You know that you don't have the knowledge. Like you say, you know, the teacher that said, oh, Jonathan, you don't have the knowledge. You don't need the knowledge. You just need to ask good questions. And this is where I think the value is. For example, if you're in sales, you know the pain of your customers. The ability to ask questions about that is powerful. You don't need to have answers, right? You just need to ask the right questions. Then to bring that back into the organization. So, you know, leaders need to be asking questions, and asking questions will be fundamentally a skill that will determine good and bad leaders in the future. You know, do they ask the right questions? And it brings us all 360 back to the 360, right? Because actually asking the 360 is a question in itself, right?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a whole topic in itself, which is so fascinating. And we were talking about the AI bots and the problem that people go for likes, not whether they love the person they're listening to or what it is, and how it can be manipulated. So they use, a bit like the Russians and the North Koreans and the Chinese are using bots to affect our political system, and who knows what went on with Brexit and things like this. As they get lots of messages created to support a particular viewpoint, and that which makes us more polarized. And of course, you know, Putin's delighted when there is, and when we all fall out with each other, and he goes, haha, another one, I've completely shagged their system and brought their country down. But what do you do when you can't really compete when a whole load of bots are giving lots of likes to somebody compared to someone, and so then everybody else thinks, oh, he's liked, so we'll all follow him too. And a bit like a whole load of lemmings going off a cliff, they all go, yeah, let's follow this person, Andrew Tate. He must be great.
We're
You know?
easily manipulated. That's the reality. Like more than we just sort of like with advertising, it works. The fact that countries or companies spend billions on it is testament to the fact it works. People think, oh, I'm not influenced by adverts. It's the same with leaders. We are. It's our human nature.
No, I think it's very interesting. We talked also, you and I, about beware of looking for popularity in your brand rather than respect. I'd much rather be respected than popular, and certainly trusted as a trusted leadership advisor to CEOs. That's my job. And if I lose the trust of a CEO, my job's over. It's finished. So trust is a really important part of people's brand. We talked about victimhood, and sometimes people can go for the poor me kind of post or whatever this is, or try and play on people's the old violins and the heartstrings, manipulating it. I can a genuine sad sorry story, but you've got to ask yourself, why am I sharing this? And I think I shared with you, I once particularly was talking about a situation where I had a 50-50 chance of cancer, and I used that as a post. And a friend of mine from my army days, Kevin, really challenged me about it. And he was right. It wasn't really for me to start sharing about that kind of thing, because other people have got equally dramatic things. It got a lot of likes and lots of sympathy and support. But actually, he goes, be careful, be really careful, because you're drawing people into your pity party. And that's not really what you're doing. The other side of the pity party is what Professor Roger Steer, a friend of mine, says is humble bragging. Oh, here is me winning an award that I put myself up for, or I paid to win this award, and here am I, getting this, and here am I getting this other award, and oh my God, I've just been promoted, and look at me, aren't I? I'm just so amazed. Humble, but just very humbled. What do you think?
I humbly accept this award. I'm very humbled by my award.
Humble bragging. What do you think?
Oh, it's ridiculous, isn't it? What do we need to say? Yeah. Well, what can you say about it? There's nothing good about it. It's just why when people say I'm very humbled by this award, why don't you just say, yeah, I'm really happy? Woohoo, go me. Like, why not just be honest? Like, people, I think that's a lot more sort of authentic than saying I'm humbled. You're not humbled. You wouldn't be shouting about it.
Ever so humble. That was a Uriah Heep, I think, in one of those stories. Just so as we come towards the end of our time, Graham, just thinking about storytelling and brand reputation. I think one of the most powerful things that you've always taught me is that really, if you want to build your brand reputation, your image and your impact, be genuinely interested in people's name and their story and their life. Because if you actually get the name right of somebody, and it's a real skill in remembering people's names. I'm sure AI chat GPT will tell you what their names are. But if you're really interested in their name and you remember their name and you ask them to tell you their story and you listen to it, they feel really seen and heard in a way that they often haven't been throughout their life. What do you think?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Like who actually sits with somebody and asks you about your story? It's a wonderful way to connect, and you get I think podcasting as a business development tool is second to none. I would like to see more people discover it and really see how it could work, because if you sat with a prospect or potential client partner and said, okay, so tell me about your story for an hour, wow, like the connection you would create with that person is second to none. Compared to a coffee conversation with somebody, it's unbelievable. And the fact is that you save it and it gets shared with the world. Yeah, I mean, I feel it's going to be a much more powerful way, especially in the world of AI as well. It's a much more powerful way to create authentic connection.
I'm so touched by people's stories, and I think learning to do that over the last 5 years, particularly, I think I was genuinely would go on walking meetings with clients, and I said, look, just tell me a story. What's shaped the kind of leader you are today? What events happened? And people that have influenced you. Tell me about it. I genuinely want to know. And if they know you really do care and you're not just going through the motions, it creates a bond, I found, with people that lasts a lifetime. Because often they haven't been heard, they haven't been seen.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about our leadership role models, their brand,
Mm,
reputation, image, and impact, how they built them, why, how they got others to willingly follow them.
mm.
Graham, you have your sort of group that we had. We had Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther
Yeah.
King, Greta Thunberg, Honda, Rosa Parks, Bill Gates, Tim Cook, Steve Jobs. What anyone you want to pick out with their brand and reputation?
No, that's a good starting group, I would say. It's interesting if you look at all of those people that you've mentioned, they are they have strong personal brands because they understood that leadership is not a personality contest. Sorry, not a popularity contest. I think it's really important that they may have been divisive. Martin Luther King's a great example. You know, at the time of the civil rights movement, he was equally hated as much as he was loved. Only in by the turn of the millennium was he voted by Gallup, I think, the most influential, the most inspirational leader of the 20th century in the US.
Mm.
So it took time, right? So I think the lesson then in those leaders is that, and for your listeners is that, if you're seeking popularity, then you won't lead properly, because the whole point of a leader is that they take people where they need to go as opposed to where they want to go, right?
Mm.
And that really defines leadership, and brands really are built around that. What does that person stand for?
Mm. No, I think that's beautifully
What
put.
do you have in your list? What do
So
you
I've
want to
got
add?
I've got Queen Elizabeth II, who I do think had an incredible brand reputation, image, and
Mm.
impact, even when it got dented
Oh,
in the
without a doubt.
in the Diana days. It did get hit hard, and the royal family got hit hard, but she brought it back in a way that people will always remember her. And then, as you know, I was reading Spare, which I did a book review on Harry and his relationship with Meghan. And actually, a lot of people are very quick to criticize him and his
Mm.
book and all he's doing, but actually read his book. And I found I could relate a lot with him.
Really?
Obviously, we both
Fellow soldier?
well, we both lost parents at a very young age,
Mm.
and it still affects us both. We both served in the army as army officers, and he'd been to boarding school, and had various hang-ups and put the mask on. This is interesting with the
Yeah.
brand. This idea that
Yeah.
I over the years as an army officer, I put on a certain mask and a certain uniform that I wear. Even going to the city, I put on a suit, whatever it might be, but we feel we have to act and behave in a certain way. And
Yeah.
people might ask, will the real Jonathan Bowman-Perks please stand up? Like, who are you? Do you know yourself? How many masks have you got? And of course, people have expectations. Well, they go, well, he's so lucky he was born to privilege. Okay, but he didn't choose to
Yeah.
be born to
Yeah.
privilege. It's just like you get the life you're born into with the
Yeah. You can't
religion, the
change that.
faith. You
Yeah.
can't change that. You can't change your family. They are who they
Mm.
are. You can choose your friends, and you can choose who you're with. And when he was in Las Vegas, it wasn't very wise to get some of the Vegas dancing girls to come in while he did strip pool, because one of them took a photograph of his derriere, and it appeared in all the papers. And yeah, taking advice on how to
But
go
who
to a
hasn't
fancy
done?
dress.
Yeah, no,
We've all done it.
exactly. Who hasn't done that? It's just that some people live in the light, the light, right? I mean, come on, you were a teenager, I was a teenager. We did some silly things, right?
Oh,
Luckily,
definitely,
it wasn't in
definitely.
the front page of the
Thank
papers.
God, thank God the mirror wasn't following me around. They would have had a field day.
It wouldn't have been pretty.
But then, of course, brand, you've got people like Sir Ernest Shackleton, General Lord
Yeah.
Danner, Marcus Aurelius, General Colin Powell, Barack Obama. I even add on there Rishi Sunak. I know he's not popular with a lot of people, but I quite like the fact that in some ways he's a bit quiet and a bit boring.
He's getting it done.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting thing, Jonathan. Like, I think there's a big thing for leaders who just get the job done. I think actually they're the best leaders. And, to some degree, I mean, I'm stepping in political ring here, but, like Biden is boring, but he gets the job done. I would much rather have Biden than Trump at the helm, right? And I'm sure some of your leaders may disagree, but, we sometimes we over celebrate the controversial leaders, but actually there's the operators who are kind of like the COOs. You kind of
Mm.
need to run stuff and just, they're practical, very pragmatic. And Rishi Sunak's a little bit like that. He's an accountant running the shop, right? And I think that's what you need. You don't need somebody who's going to kind of disrupt things.
No, I think so, right. Well, look, we just before we sort of wrap up and talk about next month, inspiring books. I mean, apart from an exceptional book called Brand Love by
Yeah,
a friend
without
of
a
mine,
doubt.
it's got to be in there. But it was. I will read. Is there an audio version, Graham?
Oh no, there isn't, I'm afraid. Yeah, I
You
didn't get
need to
around
do
to
an
it.
audio
No,
version
I
then.
know, I know, I know, I
Okay,
know. Yeah,
do an audio version, and I will review it and speak about it on the next. So that's your challenge.
it's
But
my homework.
while we're waiting for that to come out, as it will do shortly, um, I picked out a few, like "How Will You Measure Your Life" by Clayton M. Christensen.
Oh
This
yeah,
idea
good.
of thinking about your life and your brand, and what you want to be known for when you die, and
Yeah,
how will
yeah.
you know what happiness and success is?
Mm,
And happiness is an inner game. It's particularly my journey, as Graham knows, that I've been on lately, is an inner journey, the Hoffman process,
yeah.
who I am, the patterns of behavior. So I think how you measure your life and the happiness you have is very important. Why CEOs Fail, the 11 behaviors that can derail your climb to the top and how to manage them, by David Dotlich. It's linked to our darker side. So think about your brand, your strengths.
Mm,
People often hire you for your strengths, but when you overdo them, that's what brings you down, as
mm,
we know with
mm,
Dick Fould and people like that and Lehman Brothers.
mm.
The darker side, the daily laws, 366 meditations on power, seduction, mastery, strategy, and human nature by Robert Greene. A real sort of
Mm.
visit Machiavelli, the darker side of how to sort of get one over on people. I found it really
Yeah, yeah.
quite sinister to read it,
I
and
read that
gave
book. Yeah,
I sort of gave up partway through it and thought, oh yes, just. But
it's a handbook.
if you want a handbook of the dark arts of Hogwarts, that's one.
Yeah.
But one on the more happier side, don't sweat the small stuff, and it's
Mm,
all small stuff,
mm.
by Dr. Richard Carlson, which is a
Yeah,
great bestseller. A little tips and advice which I've enjoyed on
that's a great
brand
list.
and how to be. So what about you, Graham? Anything else
I
you'd
can't really add to that apart from my book. Well, maybe I'm just looking to the side of my table here. I've got, for example, the Starbucks experience.
Mm,
Um, I think it's a good one. But it's interesting, like, what I think a lot of the brand stuff is a lot of it is operational. It's about putting systems in place to make great brands. And, like brand in yourself as a leader isn't necessarily about just having inspiration. But it's having a system and a process to do that. Like, getting out. And again, it goes back to like comedy. It's like Starbucks achieved that not through having this sort of maxim or big plaque on their headquarters office wall, right? They achieved it through putting processes in place.
mm,
I think that's important. So as an individual, it's like getting out there and not saying that people aren't going to know you simply because you say one thing or publish one book. You've got to be out there all the time doing this, right? So commit to doing like a podcast regularly like you do.
mm.
That's the process, right? That's where the brand is created, not in the big picture, but in the small stuff.
Well, it's a very good consistency. It's really important
Yeah,
in your brand, that people know what you stand for. It links very closely to the other element, the moral question. What do you stand for? What will you
yeah,
fall
yeah.
for? What do you stand for? Okay, well, look, thank you, everybody. So next month, as a teaser for the leadership topic, next month will be LQ, leadership quotient,
Mm.
stewardship, and leaving a legacy in your lifetime. And like my sergeant major who said, congratulations, sir, you are a legacy in your lunchtime. But no, this is
Knock you down.
leaving a legacy in your lifetime rather after your lifetime. So if you've got any questions, please send it to jonathanperks.com or to pickal.com, Graham, on my websites. And if you know of a really inspiring leader at a senior level that people will have known of that you want to have on the show, get in touch with us if you found them very inspiring. So ending with appreciation. Graham, if I could go first and let you to have the final thought. My appreciation of you. I appreciate that you're so widely read and you meet so many interesting people and gather their stories, and you love the history connection and bringing that in. So that's what I've appreciated about you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And a bit of backstory to this podcast. We had a bit of mix up on time. I'm not going to
My
lay the
fault.
blame.
My fault.
Yeah,
My fault.
no. There you go.
I'll
Extreme
own that
ownership. Extreme
I'll own.
ownership. He's taking a lead there. That's leadership in the making. He's not just talking the talk, he walks the walk. So a bit of a mix up. 50-50. We'll flip on
100%. 100%. My fault.
He wants to own it. No, it's my fault. Anyway, we had a mix up.
I'm Spartacus. No, I'm Spartacus.
It is. We'll arm wrestle for it. I turned up late, and you were just like, it was there. And normally I would think, oh no, like if I turn up late, I'm gonna have to go, oh sorry, and all this stuff. But it was there smiling, and it's just like that positive vibe, and just all positive today. Like a lot of wins, Jonathan, today. Like, I mean, talking about what you've been working on. I know you've been through like quite a tough time, but you were sharing a lot of your positives and just staying really, really positive. It's like, it's paying off. It's like, the universe is rewarding you for hanging in there and just being positive about it. And not sort of like you've gone on this journey of inquiry, constant evolution. And it's almost like this is now the universe saying, okay, these are the fruits of your labor now. And that's all coming out. That's all the positivity. That's very inspiring. And the fact you just like really cool about it and not like, oh, I've been waiting 10, 15 minutes, which I confess I would do sometimes, because I can be like that. And then, but I'm taking a leaf out of your, next time that happens to me, I'm going to be like, okay, give this person the benefit of the doubt and see where it goes. And I'll learn from you from that. And thank you for that, because it's definitely a weak point as a leader.
Well, Graham, you've got many strengths, and it's a great honor having you as a co-host on the Inspiring Leadership podcast. And I look forward to our LQ session in a month's time. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us, and we look forward to being with you in a month's time.